The rivalry is back on.
Welcome back to another episode of the Bring the Juice podcast. I'm your host, as always, Cody Felger. Joining me back from his cruise, Mr. Derek Larger. Derek, how are you doing, man? Any tanner?
Oh, man, I'm definitely more tan in the face, that's for sure. Arms got a good coloration to them. Man, I'm really glad to be back. You know, it's as much as I will miss the 75 to 80 degree weather down there. Glad to be back here in the Midwest and glad to talk some more Colts football.
Absolutely, dude. I just burn. Like, that's like all I do. So I'm glad that you can tan at least a little bit.
Yeah, not too bad. My face is
so,
peeling a little bit.
Oh, man, that's worst. But yeah, Derek, you came back, man. There's a lot that happened in the last couple days in Colts land, and so I thought we could talk on that. Obviously, with the Combine starting this week, and, you know, with Jim Irsay having his random impromptu press conference on Sunday, and then obviously Chris Ballard and Frank Reich speaking to the media on Monday, we could kind of recap more so Ballard's comments, because I feel like those are the most telling. Ballard usually gives the best and most accurate information, and so I thought that we got some nuggets from Ballard's presser that I think we could talk about. Some free agent stuff, some draft stuff. There's just a lot of good stuff in here, and so I thought that we could kind of touch on that today. And obviously, the first one is the biggest news: Anthony Castonzo's coming back. Chris Ballard talked about it today. I believe it was like the first question he was asked about Castonzo, because Jim Irsay was asked about that on Sunday, and he said he feels like the very, very strong indication that Castonzo was going to come back. And then Ballard confirmed it today, saying that the 31-year-old left tackle would be back for his 10th NFL season now, and that certainly is obviously huge news for the Colts, and especially that's something that we have talked about, Derek, in the last few weeks. Is now really that Castonzo domino was going to be a big deal, and it was going to be a big thing. If he did retire, that would really change potentially your draft strategy going forward in 2020.
Yeah.
But he's back for another season. Obviously, huge news for the Colts, and it should give some Colts fans a sigh of relief. I know that Ballard said when he heard that he had a big smile come across his face, and that's kind of the vibe I think Colts fans should be feeling right now with Castonzo coming back. One of the better left tackles in the league, if not top 5 left tackles in the league. And Ballard kind of commented on it and said it's a year-to-year thing with Castonzo. Obviously, we know that he had talked about last offseason how this is the best that he's felt in a long time. But he is getting up there in age. And so, Derek, I thought that this is something that we could kind of debate and kind of talk about. Obviously, Castonzo's coming back for another year, so you don't, left tackle isn't, I wouldn't say a top 5 need anymore. But is it still something where, if it's year to year, that could mean next year Castonzo retires? Do you think it's something where the Colts this year in this draft or in free agency need to address that left tackle position for the future? And where do you think they should look to find potentially that left tackle the future if this year?
Yeah, and when you say Chris Ballard had a smile on his face, that's no exaggeration. Frank Reich in his presser stated that he heard Chris Ballard screaming from a couple rooms down the hall in the stadium earlier that day as well. So, Ballard's definitely pumped, as Colts Nation definitely should be, to have a top 5 left tackle return for another season, possibly more, is definitely a great thing to have. Ballard talked about the cohesiveness that this offensive line group has and the relationship they have and the chemistry. It's second to none to anyone in the NFL right now. So it's really nice to know that Castonzo is going to come back. Obviously, Castonzo's working on a deal with Ballard right now. Probably be a few days until we get something. Excuse me. It's kind of one of those things where, you hope that Ballard's able to get him the money that he wants, and sitting on that kind of cap space that he has right now, I'm not too worried about how much money Castonzo is going to ask for, because I'm sure Ballard will pay him. You're right. It's one of those things. You mentioned how do the Colts need to continue to look for more left tackles, even though we know Castonzo is going to be back for at least one more year. Yes, that is definitely something you still need to consider. You can never have too much offensive line depth, especially in today's NFL. It helps to have more guys to help on that offensive line. And not necessarily this year. Now that we know that Castonzo is coming back, like you mentioned, the left tackle position is not necessarily a need anymore. Now that we know that he's going to be coming back, but it is something that, a little later on in the draft, you could potentially look at. I mentioned on Twitter that now Ballard can focus on other needs that this team has right now versus having to worry about a left tackle, which is great because, regardless of where we end up next year, I'm quite positive that Ballard won't address it this year. He'll most likely address it in next year's draft when obviously we don't know if Castonzo's coming back or not, but that would be a good time next year, whether it be with that first or second round pick, to address that left tackle situation because Castonzo at any given moment will most likely want to leave. So either way, I don't think Ballard's going to be too interested in looking at left tackle early in this draft. You could see something later on, but man, am I pumped to have Anthony Castonzo back. I mean, it is just a huge relief off of our shoulders to know that Anthony Castonzo, a good left tackle, is coming back, and it's going to help whatever quarterback we have for this next season. Certainly will help the cohesiveness of that offense. It will stay intact, and that is exactly what we needed. Again, regardless of whether Castonzo stays multiple years or just 1 year, this just helps Ballard to the point where he can focus on either getting a quarterback or wide receivers in this draft and then focus on left tackle next year when he knows that Castonzo's on a short leash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is huge. Obviously, we know ever since Chris Ballard was drafted, it seems like there's just been something after the other. That's just kind of been unforeseen that he's had to basically deal with and clean up.
Mm-hmm.
And, potentially the domino of losing your starting left tackle obviously is huge. And it would be losing your quarterback and your left tackle in consecutive off seasons. That just would be absolutely insane. So this is good news for Ballard, who's just had to deal with a lot. But you're right, Derek. It is huge. I wanted to pull up a quote from Ballard when he was kind of talking about when he was kind of talking about the year-to-year basis of Castonzo. He was kind of talking about that position moving forward, and he said that I think that's a position you always need to look at from a developmental standpoint because of the speed of the game, the changes in technique on that O-line. I think it's better to anticipate that a year or two earlier and start to get some guys in the pipeline. We've been fortunate here because we've had Joe Haig and the Raven Clark. We've had some young guys that have been able to develop when they have had to step up and play. We were able to continue to play good football up front. We definitely have to keep our eye on that. So to me, Derek, that could potentially say Chris Ballard realizes that he got really, really lucky last year with how much that offensive line stayed relatively healthy throughout the year. And let's be real, like that doesn't normally happen in the NFL. Normally one of your starters goes out and at least misses a couple games. And so to me, that kind of screams maybe mid-round offensive tackle, offensive guard, offensive lineman somewhere. Try to get some young guys kind of in the pipeline. Maybe that's not the spending, the first couple rounds drafting your future left tackle, but I just think getting some young offensive linemen in there, and even if you bring back a Joe Haig, or even if you want to bring back Raven Clark for a prove it year, whatever you want to do, you just got to get some young guys in there that you can continue to develop. So if one of those guys does go down, you have some insurance and you have some help on that offensive line. And so I thought that quote was really telling to me. Another thing that Ballard was talking about and he was asked about was Jordan Love. And Jordan Love had, it's been reported that Love has already said that he's met with the Colts. And Ballard was particularly asked about, Jordan Love's kind of rise in interceptions from 2018 to 2019. And he really spoke highly of him a lot. And really talked about, the interceptions. He compared him actually to Matt Ryan when Matt Ryan was coming out of Boston College, and he was basically saying you got to break down each and every one of those interceptions and see why did it happen, because it's not always on the quarterback. And I think that's really a good – I really like that about Ballard. He knows that stats don't tell the entire story for a quarterback. And I think that's been kind of the biggest thing, biggest knock, I guess, against Love was those turnovers. I guess I'm curious, Derek, what are your thoughts on kind of what Ballard's rationale there is? And if the Colts were to take, say, Jordan Love at 13, would you kind of agree with his rationale? Do you think all those interceptions were not necessarily – obviously the quarterback's going to get the fault for it, but do you think that there's more than just the stats that tell the story of Jordan Love, and that's why the Colts should potentially be interested?
Yeah, we were right. They mentioned that Jordan Love spoke with the Colts today, and Justin Herbert also met with the Colts today, also had high praise for what the Colts are doing. Look for that to be a development as well. But certainly it seems as though they had a much more in-depth conversation with Jordan Love, and hearing that he would love to be with the Colts is a good thing to hear. I know I said that on Twitter, and a lot of people were saying how, shouldn't they always say that? Yeah, they should, but some like to use the word like rather than love. There's a difference between the two words there and their definition. So hearing Jordan Love say that is definitely a good thing. And, I think any quarterback coming out of this draft would love to be in this Colts system, with the offensive line that they have and the ability to run the ball and some experienced wide receivers, some young wide receivers, a good offensive-minded coach, very well-ran program, organization amongst all those. So, it's an ideal spot for any quarterback, right? And Jordan Love obviously fits that system. I'm starting to get the sense that Ballard and their staff really, really like Jordan Love. Because like you mentioned, Matt Ryan drew the comparisons for him and Jordan Love in college. Ballard had to point it out that, what did he throw? 19 interceptions in college. So you're right. You kind of have to break down every interception because you're right. The stats don't always tell the story. Stats don't lie, but sometimes they can be misconstrued. You have to dissect every single one of those interceptions and see how did it happen? Was it actually his fault? Did it happen to go through a guy's hands and had to do that? Because remember, we said that same thing about Andrew Luck a lot, where, he threw some interceptions, but there were a bunch of them, especially in his last year at the Colts, where guys were just dropping the ball and it was landing in defenders' hands. I mean, you can't knock that on the quarterback. That's what I wish that football would adopt, is they would not count that interception towards the quarterback, but rather towards the wide receiver that actually dropped it. I feel like that could be a new stat that football should adopt, because it's not a quarterback's fault when he puts it on the money, a guy drops it and somebody else gets it. And we all know that, a small percentage of interceptions every year are because of that. So, you're right. You have to take it with a grain of salt and dissect it and understand how it happened. And I do like Jordan Love's response to that, stating, if I didn't want to talk about it, then I wouldn't have thrown them. It's like, it's a great response to the idea that, I'm manning up to these interceptions. I threw them because, I'm a gunslinger. I like to go out and make plays, and sometimes I'll make mistakes. He owns up to that and he understands it. And I'm sure that Frank Reich and whoever he has will end up, helping him to get better along the way. But it's just going to show you that he's willing to go that extra mile and take responsibility for the mistakes that he made. And he's owning up to it. And I like to hear that response. And, it's certainly sounding like, Colts Twitter is salivating after today, because they're just loving the Jordan Love hype that everybody is spewing out. The national media also is very impressed with Jordan Love's responses to today. So, It was definitely a good day for Jordan Love, and I did like what I was hearing from him and from Chris Ballard dissecting him.
Yeah, and you look at, it's kind of crazy to look at their, the stats from 2019 from touchdown to interception stats, because in 2018, I mean, he had 32 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, like really, really good. And then 2019, 20 touchdowns, 17 interceptions. So there's more to the story that the stats aren't telling you. And I think that that's something that's key in looking at, situations. He had to basically lost his entire coaching staff. Like that's big for a quarterback, developing in college. And so I think there's a lot of things that you have to factor in there that aren't being told. And I think that's a big reason why, if you get him into your system, you get him, consistent coaching. And I think you just see the talent there. And I think that's a big thing that Ballard has been big on, especially in his drafts. And you can look back at some players who the production didn't necessarily match where they got drafted, but they were athletic. They were this, they were that. They had a blue chip trade, as Ballard always puts it. And that's the reason why he drafted him there. And I mean, you saw it with certain players that he's drafted. Some have worked out, some have not really worked out. But that's kind of how Ballard is. And so I would not be shocked at all, Derek, if you see that if Jordan Love's there at 13 and Chris Ballard takes him, because there's a lot more than stats that tell the story there. But going off of that, I think it can also be fair. I know a lot of people like to rag on Jacoby Brissett a lot and kind of say, man, he's terrible. He's not a good quarterback at all. But you got to factor in some things as well. And Ballard kind of talked about this as well. He didn't want to place all the blame on the MCL injury that Brissett suffered in November, but he also wanted to acknowledge the first half of the season. Yeah, maybe necessarily he wasn't, playing at a top quarterback level, but I mean, he was playing winning football for the Colts, and they had a winning record. Obviously, the record speaks for itself. But then, he contributed to, injuries among the wide receiver position and not playing with some wide receivers, basically having to get wide receivers off of the street that were playing and starting for you. And that's just something. And he also acknowledged that the Colts need more out of Brissett. But I guess if you're making the argument for Jordan Love, could you also make an argument for Jacoby Brissett? Again, I know he's 27. He's not necessarily a young quarterback anymore. But there were some factors that I think need to be considered as well with Brissett. And I guess Derek, I'm curious, how much do we place on, injuries versus Brissett's just not a good quarterback or whatever you want to do there? Where do you stand in terms of, making excuses for injury, making excuses for, maybe injury to Brissett, injury to the receiver core, injury to whatever, and then just Brissett needing to play better? Where do you kind of stand on that, on those two different things?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, all the injuries that we had played a gigantic role in how that last half of the season went. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, ultimately, it's just one of those things that, every team has, every team has injuries throughout the year, but the Colts just had it much worse than a bunch of other teams. And, it was weird hearing Ballard, because I felt like he didn't want to contradict himself on, how to perceive Jacoby Brissett, because, he was giving him the benefit of the doubt with, him obviously being injured halfway through the year. And then all of those wide receivers being hurt certainly didn't help him at all. So, you wanted to say that, but then, you also wanted to say that, it was the tale of two seasons when it came to that one particular season. And certainly the back half certainly didn't look good for Jacoby. So it really is a wonder how Ballard's going to look at it. I mean, we still have no idea whether or not Ballard's really going to fall in love with Jordan Love and pick him or not. And here's the thing also with what was being stated today about Mike Mayock with the Raiders GM. It sounds like the Raiders are going to possibly move on from Derek Carr. And that's another team that's most likely going to want to draft a quarterback. And the good news is with the Panthers, it's being reported that they're most likely going to stick it out with Cam Newton. But, now you're going to have the Bengals, the Dolphins, and the Chargers, possibly the Raiders, possibly the Lions that are, going to think about quarterbacks. So I think even if you want to get Love, Ballard might have to cough up some draft picks in order to move up, because if we wait at 13, there's no guarantee that Jordan Love is still there.
Yeah, that's definitely something that is going to need to be considered. And again, with the Lions, you just don't know. I mean, there were reports, there were reports out there. The Lions were interested in trading Stafford, and then they came out and said those are absolutely false. So the Lions could stay with Stafford, and they could try to draft other positions and address other positions. But you're right, Derek. That's something that the Colts are definitely going to have to consider, because there are legitimately like 4 or 5 teams that could be interested in drafting quarterbacks ahead of you. And, if you think, obviously, Joe Burrow is probably going to go number 1. Then you got Tua, who could go really anywhere in the top 5. And then you got Justin Herbert, who, we've talked about, but he's probably going to go before you're getting there. And then you got Jordan Love. And those numbers don't add up favorably for the Colts, at least right now, in terms of mock drafts and stuff like that, for where they currently sit. So if the Colts truly believe that they, if they truly fall in love with the guy, I think they're going to have to pull Kansas City Chiefs a little bit. Maybe not necessarily give up as much, but they got to go up and get their guy. And I think that's what the Colts know they have to do. And that's just kind of how you have to do it now. We've seen teams time and time again. Heck, most of the teams, excluding a few last year that were in the playoffs, went up and drafted their guy. And I think that's what the Colts are going to have to do. If they truly do love Jordan Love or Justin Herbert or one of these quarterbacks, they got to go up and get their guy for sure. Mm-hmm. Another thing that Chris Ballard really talked about was a free agent, was like free agency, and talking about, this is something that Ballard has not really done yet, is add a big name free agent. I mean, you could potentially talk me into Justin Houston being considered a big name free agent. But one that you see kind of on the first day of the draft, where it's one of the big name guys, one of the top premier players at the position on the market. And Chris Ballard really talked about it. For the first time, he said he feels like his locker room is ready to handle a talented free agent. Mm-hmm. Maybe a guy that doesn't check every single character box of the team. And obviously, we know it takes 2 to tango as far as free agency goes. Like the Colts have to obviously be interested, and the person, the potential free agent has to be interested in coming to Indianapolis. But I think that's telling, Derek. I think that tells something about kind of where the locker room stands, as opposed to 2017 when Ballard came in and didn't really bring in any free agents, and hasn't brought in the high named, high priced free agents. And I think that's just interesting now looking at it, as opposed to even last year when Ballard didn't really bring in one of those guys. What are your takeaways kind of from Ballard's comments on free agency?
This is like really weird to hear, because I was working out and I looked at it and I had to look back through the tweet again. I was like, is this real? Like, we've never heard Chris Ballard say such a thing. I mean, he's talked about obviously signing free agents. He's certainly not afraid to sign a few free agents, but has never mentioned the words, our locker room is ready for a big time free agent. Like, we've never heard that uttered out of his mouth before. So it really does make me think that Ballard is prepared to offer a marquee guy some decent money to bring him to Indy. I think just a matter of who that is exactly. We got a bunch of different guys that, are potentials for that. We obviously know Jadeveon Clowney, Chris Jones, Byron Jones, Yannick is still out there. So there's a bunch of different guys out there, especially on the defensive line, that we could bring in as a potential free agent. And, and there's some other guys too. And I know that the Vikings said that they're not really interested in moving on from Stephon Diggs, but if Diggs doesn't want to stick around and Indy were to offer him a decent sized contract, then I don't see why not. But I
Mhm.
mean, it is one of those things that I'm very glad to hear that. And, I don't think a lot of Colts Nation saw that tweet, but if they did, I think it's certainly giving fuel to the fire for those people that have been asking for Ballard to do this now for 3 years. I mean, this is long overdue for a lot of people, but it's nice that you actually have some cap room now that you can actually spend. So it's
Mhm.
good to see Ballard talking that way and thinking that our locker room is complete enough now and is unified enough now that he feels confident that bringing in a what they would call a risk guy to come in and help this team out. It's really good to hear.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks, Derek, to Chris Ballard has really, really emphasized ever since he came to Indianapolis. You got to draft guys. You got to build your team through the draft, and I think that kind of emphasizes where Ballard thinks his team is in terms of how good of a team he thinks he has around him, how good of a core he thinks he has around him,
Mhm.
and that should be encouraging for Colts fans as well.
Yeah.
Just where the team is now, as opposed to even a year ago. I think you could make the argument that yes, the team had less wins in 2019, but overall, it's a better team. It's a more talented team than it was in 2018.
Mhm.
And it must speak to just kind of how Ballard feels as far as his roster is going. So that's definitely something that's really, really good to hear from Ballard. And that's something the Colts fans should be excited about. The last thing I wanted to talk about, Derek, was the whole idea. So Chris Ballard was asked about Paris Campbell, a guy that really well, being an Ohio State fan, a guy who came in and really just got injured, came back, got injured, came back, showed flaws, kept getting injured. And he really, Chris Ballard is really high. And he said the Colts are still really, really, really high on Paris Campbell for what he did. I mean, he only played in 7 games last year, but the Colts are feeling really, really good about Paris Campbell. What are your
Mhm.
thoughts on Campbell? Watching him throughout his career at Ohio State and then watching him in his first year with the Colts.
Yeah, I do definitely know a lot about him, and I actually spent a decent amount of time with him on the cruise. Actually, he was there.
Really?
Yeah, he was on the cruise, and
Wow.
it was his first year being on the Buckeye cruise. So, and also for anyone that cares, this Buckeye cruise that I went on, we raised $4.25 million for cancer research on this cruise.
Wow.
So it's huge. That is a lot of money. It was for a great cause. I'm glad I was able to go. And obviously, Buckeyes like Paris Campbell and a few others that are new to the Buckeye cruise. They went on the cruise with us, and he certainly looks happy. He certainly looks healthy to me. He certainly doesn't have too many issues. I thought it was funny when my dad and I went to an autograph session and we had him sign some stuff. My dad got a 30 by 20 picture of him on his famous touchdown run where he smoked the entire Michigan defense, and he had a
Hmm.
picture of Paris actually looking back at all the Michigan players trailing him. It was funny to see his reaction. And when I had my picture, which was his first touchdown catch, he obviously loved that too with the Colts. So he certainly looks good, certainly looks happy to me. I love that Ballard had such high praise for him. I know that a lot of Colts Twitter is still not sold on him, and they obviously have a good reason. We didn't see a really whole lot of him last year, but it's good to see that he's taking those extra steps to get physically and mentally ready for next season and to make sure he doesn't have as many of those injury problems, which is good to see. And obviously, Ballard's correct. Uh, Paris Campbell has a lot of upside, has a lot of potential. We saw it in the limited minutes. Again, we've seen it in the limited minutes that we saw from him last season. When he was in, he made plays, and it's good to see. And I'm certainly excited for him, and I certainly can't wait to see him shine for year 2 and help make this team a little better than what he left it as last year.
Yeah, and Ballard really talked about Campbell, and the one thing that you have to love about him is he works hard and he wants to be the
Yeah.
best player that he can be. And Ballard really talked about how he really has not left the building since the end of the season. He said he's been working, he's been rehabbing, he's been getting his body right. I think he understands, how to get his body right for the grind of the NFL. And Derek, this is something that we see with guys coming into the league. Is some guys come into the league and they just, they go from so many games to 16 games, maybe even longer if they make the postseason. And then, you throw in the preseason too, they play so they play over 20 games. And that's a huge leap, especially, even if you're coming from one of the better conferences, even if you're playing against the best of the best, that's a lot more football that you have to train your body for. And we see a lot of young players who come in and finally figure out, going into year 2 and year 3, how to get their body right, how to get their body ready for the grind of the NFL season. Because it's brutal, and especially at a position like wide receiver, you can't afford to be really nicked up at all, because if you're nicked up at all, you really can't do much, especially, if you're running all the time. Your whole job is, outrunning, what Paris Campbell does really well, outrunning defenders. And if you're injured, if you're nicked up, you can't really do that really well. So it's really good to see that Paris Campbell's working on getting his body right, getting his body better, and that he understands that and that he wants to get better. So, that's really what we wanted to talk about today in this podcast. Derek, I don't know if you have anything else to say, but that's really what I wanted to talk about, was really highlighting the Ballard press conference and kind of highlighting what that means for the Colts as, free agency starts in a couple weeks and then the draft starts in April, all coming very, very quickly, by the way. But is there anything, Derek, you wanted to add before we hop off here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the NFL Combine is this week and this weekend. I'm going to obviously be keeping an eye on it. I'm sure Cody will as well. Be sure to keep an eye out, guys, for any sleeper picks. Obviously, some big names said they're not going to be there, but some stuff that we still need to watch, especially the quarterbacks that are going to participate. And Javon Kinlaw is another one that we got to watch on, I believe it is Saturday when they partake, the defensive linemen do. So, excuse me. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the Combine for sure. Obviously, like you stated, draft is 2 months away. It's getting to be really, really close now. I can't wait. And my goodness, guys, it is definitely a great week to be an Indianapolis Colt. This week has definitely started off on a good note, and I'm hoping it keeps going that way.
And by the way, let's make sure to keep the Combine in Indianapolis. I think it's a perfect spot for it.
Abso-freaking-lutely, man. I mean, honestly, I don't even know why you wouldn't want to keep it there. It's almost in the middle of the country. It's in a very nice area. It's in an indoor, very nice complex. It's been organized this way for years. I mean, and I don't see any issue to take it away. I mean, it's a great place to have it for in this kind of setting. So, yeah, I mean, absolutely. If I have to go to my knees and beg the board to make sure that they keep it in Indianapolis, I, amongst probably thousands of others, would love to do the exact same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that Jim Irsay came out and said that in his press conference. He's like, we want to keep it in Indianapolis. And I think it's a perfect spot. Indianapolis is great. They did great when they hosted the Super Bowl years ago. It's just a great city and a great host city for a lot of places. And the draft should definitely stay in Indy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that does it for this episode. Be sure to check back, guys, soon. I've been doing some top lists, so I'll have to get Derek in on the action coming up soon. And for any of you who are on cruises or being warm somewhere or jealous, it's supposed to snow apparently tomorrow, so that's great. But thanks, guys. As always, we really appreciate your support. Excited for the Combine, excited for just the off season to start to progress. We kind of were in a lull part of the off season. So really excited for stuff to start picking up a little bit. And I can't wait for free agency. Even if the Colts don't really partake in it a lot of times, I just love it. I just love seeing how much players get overpaid.
Yeah.
How much B players get A+ player money. It's kind of entertaining for me. So
yes,
I'm excited for that, man. It's coming quick and I can't wait. And I think that does it. So thanks, guys, and go Colts.